Day 31. The sky looked wrong at dawn, not cloudy, not clear, just heavy, like it was holding something it didn't want to drop too close. We felt it before the radios confirmed it. Even the enemy seemed to sense it. Their fire was cautious, measured, like men stepping around a sleeping animal. Mortars fell farther out, and recoilless rifles spoke less often. The hills above us felt tense rather than aggressive. Then the word came through. Arc light. You don't cheer when you hear that. Not at first. You pray whoever the CIA field agent planned it measure correctly. By mid-morning, the sound arrived. Not like jets, not like artillery, but a deep, rolling pressure that built before the noise did. The ground seemed to tense under our boots. Then the horizon broke. The first wave of B-52 bombs landed beyond the ridgelines, far enough not to kill us, but close enough to rearrange everything the enemy had built. The sound wasn't an explosion. It was a tearing, like the sky ripping cloth from the earth. The valley flexed, teeth rattled, and men pressed flat without being told. I have lived through many kinds of fire, but nothing prepares you for that. The second wave of American B-52 followed before the echoes finished dying. Then a third B-52 wave bombed the enemy's rear areas, their assembly points, and their supply routes, places we had known were there, but could never quite reach. The hills answered with dust and smoke that climbed straight up, then folded back on themselves. With trees vanished, slopes slumped, and the jungle screamed in its own way. Enemy fire stopped completely, not thinned, not shifted, but stopped. For hours we stayed low anyway. Arc light makes even veterans nervous, because the margin for error is not measured in meters, it's measured in lives. When the sound finally faded, the valley fell hollowed out, like something enormous had passed through and left a vacuum behind it. Men lifted their heads slowly, as if afraid the world might still be falling. We used the quiet immediately, sending observation teams forward, carefully, shallow, and never cresting Skyline's ridge. Radios crackled with reports that came back uneven and stunned, with enemy's positions erased, bunkers gone, supply trails torn open like wounds. Not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough. The enemy was still alive, that was never in doubt, but their rhythm had been broken. The afternoon passed in a strange half-light, smoke filtering the sun, shadows soft where they should have been sharp. We repositioned again, cautiously expanding a few meters here, reclaiming a sliver of space there, nothing bold, nothing proud, just breathing room. That night, the hills were quiet in a new way. No sound of enemies digging, and no sound of enemies' voices. I lay awake listening to nothing, which felt almost obscene after so much sound. My body kept expecting the ground to move again. Day 31 ended with Long Tieng still surrounded. But for the first time since this began, the enemy was the one counting what he had lost. We had not won, but the siege had cracked. Day 32. The morning felt hollow, and that was the only word for it after the violence of yesterday. The valley seemed scooped out, like something essential had been removed and not yet replaced. Smoke still hung over the hills, drifting in lazy layers that blurred distance and softened edges. The sun rose dull and red, as if embarrassed to look too closely at what had been done. No enemy fire greeted the dawn, not a single mortar, not a single rifle crack. That silence was different from the silences before. Those had been deliberate, predatory. While this one felt stunned, I kept everyone on alert anyway. Arc light leaves behind confusion as often as it leaves fear. As the light strengthened, we began to see what the bombing had changed. Entire stretches of ridgeline looked shaved raw. Tree lines that had sheltered enemy movement were gone, replaced by tangled wreckage and exposed earth. Trails we had mapped in our heads for weeks simply ended in craters. The enemy had lost more than men. They had lost certainty. By mid-morning, cautious movement appeared again. Small groups, widely spaced, moving slowly and stopping often. Enemy survivors. New orders filtering down. Officers trying to understand a battlefield that no longer matched their maps. We took advantage without getting greedy. I ordered small and careful adjustments forward. Nothing that would tempt artillery, nothing that would silhouette men against the sky, just reclaiming folds of ground that had been death yesterday and were merely dangerous today. Men moved with a different posture now, still tired, still cautious, but less hunched. Around noon, the airstrip opened briefly without immediate fire. One CIA Air America aircraft landed cleanly, engines echoing off the hills with no enemy's mortars chasing it, and no recoilless rifle spoke. That sound, the uncomplicated landing of a plane, felt almost obscene in its normality. Supplies came in, wounded went out, the world touched us again. The enemy answered late in the afternoon with scattered, ineffective fire with a few of mortar rounds that fell wide. A rifle crack from too far away to matter. Felt like frustration more than strategy. We did not respond. Sometimes restraint speaks louder than guns. As evening approached, I walked farther forward than I had dared in days, crawling to an observation point that had been unusable since February. From there, I looked up at the hills that had bled us. They were still dangerous, still occupied, but no longer dominant. That night, the jungle was quiet in a way I'd almost forgotten. No sound of close digging, no casual voices, just insects and wind and the sound of men sleeping deeply for the first time in weeks. I lay back and let the earth support my weight instead of resisting it. Day 32 ended with Long Tieng still under threat, but no longer under immediate suffocation. The enemy had been stopped mid-motion, and in war, stopping momentum, even briefly, can change everything. Day 33. I woke to a sound I hadn't trusted in weeks, and CIA Air America aircraft landing, and staying, not a scream and go, not wheels touch dirt then run, a real landing, engines throttled down. That alone told me yesterday had mattered. The morning air was cool and clear, the smoke finally lifting enough to let the valley look like a place again instead of a wound. The ridgelines were still scarred, still hostile, but something in their posture had changed. They fell farther away, not in distance, but in intent. The enemy did not fire at dawn, but we stayed cautious anyway, staying alert to remain in place, with rifles stayed forward. Men moved low out of habit now, not orders. Habits like that don't fade quickly, and they shouldn't. By mid-morning, the airstrip operated in short, careful windows. Aircraft came in one at a time, engines hot, pilots alert, but they landed. Supplies came in at a pace that felt almost generous after the hunger of the past days. I watched wounded men get loaded properly this time, bandaged, stabilized, not rushed aboard like cargo. That sight hit me harder than any bomb. It meant we weren't just surviving anymore, we were functioning. Enemy movement remained cautious. Observation teams spotted small enemy groups repositioning, digging new positions farther back than before, not retreating, but recalibration. The enemy was learning how far the sky would reach and where it might strike again. They were no longer pressing downhill, and that mattered more than anything. In the afternoon, we made a count to movement. Nothing dramatic. A squad forward to reoccupy a shallow fold of terrain abandoned during the worst shelling. They moved slow, checked everything twice, and came back reporting no contact. That word felt strange in my mouth. As evening approached, morale shifted in subtle ways. Men talked a little louder. Someone cleaned his boots even though they'd be dirty again by morning. Small acts of normalcy crept back in, careful and tentative. At dusk, I walked the line and realized something quietly important. For the first time since February, I wasn't just reacting, I was choosing. Night fell without incident. No enemy probes, no sound of enemy digging close enough to hear. The jungle reclaimed its own sounds again. Lying in my fighting hole, I didn't imagine tomorrow ending us. I imagined it continuing. Day 33 ended not with victory, but with something just as rare in a siege. Momentum, slow, fragile, and hard-earned, tilting back toward us. Day 34. The morning felt cautious, not hopeful, not afraid, just cautious, like two men circling each other after someone has been knocked down and gone back up. I woke to quiet again, but not the stunned quiet of yesterday. This one had intent behind it, The hills were occupied. The enemy was there, but he was thinking. We stayed alert longer than usual. No one complained. Trust had shifted now, from fear of collapse to respect for patience. By mid-morning, we saw it clearly. The enemy was digging in away from us, not retreating, but repositioning. Enemy new bunkers farther back, new enemy trails cut laterally instead of downhill. Enemy heavy weapons pulled to positions less exposed to air. They had learned where the sky could reach, and were adjusting their spine accordingly. That told me something important. They were no longer confident enough to finish us cheaply. We answered in kind, not with bravado, but with discipline. I ordered the platoon to improve what we held rather than push. Overhead cover strengthened, communication lines improved, fields of fire refined. This was not a day for taking ground. This was a day for making ground expensive. Around noon, enemy artillery spoke again, but poorly. A few mortar rounds landed wide, almost careless. Enemy frustration fire. We didn't respond. In the afternoon, air activity continued overhead. Not strikes, just presence. Aircraft passed low enough to remind the hills that what had happened could happen again. The enemy stayed put. I sent a small patrol forward. Experienced men only. To confirm what our eyes suggested, they returned quietly, reporting abandoned enemy fighting holes, equipment destroyed in place, and no fresh blood. The enemy had left in an orderly way, not a panicked one, and that distinction matters. As the sun dropped, the valley looked different again, not peaceful, but stable. The airstrip functioned intermittently without harassment. Radios sounded less strained. Men sat back on their heels instead of crouching forward. That night, I slept lightly, but without the expectation of immediate violence. Day 34 ended without gunfire worth remembering, and that in this war meant everything. The enemy had not given up, but he had stopped charging the door. From now on, this would be a contest of endurance. And for the first time since February, I believe we might last longer than he wanted. Day 35. The morning arrived quietly enough to make men uneasy. Just the low hum of insects and the sound of boots shifting in dirt as men changed watch positions. After weeks of reacting to violence, the absence of it felt like standing on ground that might give way. I didn't let the platoon relax, and for weapons to stay loaded. I had learned long ago that calm after punishment often hides intent. The enemy was still out there. I could feel it in the way the hills looked back at us, unchanged in shape, altered in meaning. By mid-morning, aircraft passed overhead again, not striking, just reminding. Their presence shaped the day more than bombs ever could. Every aircraft that crossed the sky told the enemy the same thing. Don't forget what happens when you gather too openly. Enemy movement stayed minimal, a few distant figures shifting positions, no attempts to close the distance, no enemy probing fire. They were waiting, and so were we. The day became one of maintenance, of bodies, of weapons, of minds. I rotated men who hadn't slept properly in days, forced food into hands that didn't feel hunger anymore, made men clean weapons that were already clean, just to give their thoughts somewhere to go. Fatigue doesn't announce itself, it erodes. In the afternoon, a runner brought news from another sector. No major contact, lines holding, that word again, holding. I walked farther than usual, checking in with neighboring units, exchanging quiet nods instead of reports. We were all reading the same signs. The enemy was no longer pushing, not because he couldn't, but because the price had risen. As evening approached, clouds gathered high, but never thickened enough to threaten air operations. The weather held, as if even the sky had chosen sides for now. At dusk, I stood at an observation point and looked across the valley. Smoke no longer hung low. Fires were fewer. Long Tieng looked wounded but alive. That night, sleep came easier. And that worried me more than any shell, because wars don't end when they go quiet. They end when one side-to-side silence is no longer useful. Day 35 ended without violence, without loss, without ground changing hands. But it ended with a question hanging over us all. Was this the pause before the enemy's withdrawal? or the pause before something new. Day 36. I woke from a deep, sudden sleep and hated myself for it. That's how I knew the danger hadn't passed. When your body finally steals rest without asking, it's because it believes the threat has moved elsewhere. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of cold that sharpens edges and makes sounds travel. I could hear voices far off on the ridges. Not close enough to understand, but close enough to know they weren't worried about being overheard. The enemy was reorganizing. We stayed disciplined, and no one exposed themselves on Skyline's ridge, and no one wandered downhill out of boredom. Boredom is how sieges kill men after the shooting slows. By mid-morning, reconnaissance confirmed that enemy units had pulled back slightly, establishing new lines that respected the sky. Heavier weapons were farther from the slopes that overlooked us. Enemy infantry positions were staggered and defensive instead of aggressive. This wasn't defeat. It was a pause to reset. I gathered my squad leaders and spoke plainly. They're not done. They're choosing how to continue. That afternoon, we felt a change in tempo. Instead of pressure, there was distance. Instead of harassment, there was observation. We spotted glints of optics on ridges we hadn't worried about since February. The enemy was watching us again, not to attack, but to count, so we gave them little to count. We reduced movement, shifted positions under cover, used runners instead of radios when possible. Every action felt deliberate, as if the whole valley had slowed to match the enemy's thinking. Late in the day, a single mortar round landed far wide. Almost careless, no follow-up, just a punctuation mark, not a sentence. We didn't respond. As evening fell, clouds gathered low and thin, threatening weather but never committing. The air stayed flyable, and that mattered. I walked the line at dusk, noticing details I hadn't had time for in weeks, hands steadier on rifles, eyes that still tracked shadows out of habit. The men weren't relaxed, they were ready. That night, the jungle stayed quiet in a way that felt intentional. No enemy probing, no digging nearby, no enemy voices close enough to catch. I lay awake longer than I needed to, thinking about momentum, the thing everyone talks about but no one can see. Momentum doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it stalls, sometimes it waits. Day 36 ended without violence, but it ended with clarity. The enemy had stopped trying to crush us. Now he was deciding whether to stay. Day 37. That morning, I stayed cautious and remained alert in place. Men stayed low, but I let myself listen more carefully than usual, not for threats, but for absence. War teaches you that absence is information if you know how to read it. By mid-morning, reconnaissance confirmed. Enemy artillery activity had dropped significantly. Mortar positions that had been active for weeks were quiet. Recoilless rifle pits showed no fresh movement. They weren't gone, but they weren't speaking anymore, and that mattered. Enemy infantry movement still existed on the ridges, but it was sparse, almost defensive. The airstrip operated longer today. CIA Air America aircraft landed without immediate harassment, unloading supplies in daylight without rushing as if chased by ghosts. The sound of engines idling felt almost indecent after weeks of chaos. You could see it in the way heads lifted, in the way conversations didn't immediately die when an aircraft touched down. In the afternoon, I authorized limited patrols. Experienced men only, slow and cautious. They returned reporting no contact. Enemy positions were still there, but thinner, some bunkers abandoned, some trails unused, but there were signs of supply movement. The enemy was consolidating, not advancing. That night, I walked even farther forward, crawling to a position that had once been under constant fire. From there, I looked up at the hills and realized something quietly profound. They no longer felt like they were leaning toward us. They felt like they were looking past us. Day 37 ended without combat, but it ended with the first true signal that the siege's peak had passed. Not in a dramatic collapse, but in a gradual release of pressure, like fingers loosening after holding too tight for too long. But we were still surrounded, still threatened, still at war. But for the first time it felt like the enemy was deciding how to leave, not how to finish us.